Hello, this is Daniel Raymond, the voice behind Ray's Guide, and I'm still getting over cold, so my tones might not be quite as dulcet as usual, but I didn't want things to get too far along before I read between the lines of Chris Roberts' year-end message. And of course, I'm not going to really comment much about the metrics and milestones and get right to the technical stuff, because that's what viewers of this channel are coming for. And I thought that I would start with the thing that everyone else seems to be flipping out about, and that is 4.0 and Pyro being in our hands by the end of next year rather than the time frame outlined in the prior letter. But honestly, if you just applied the delay already experienced in 3.18 to their start of 4.0, you're already halfway through 2023, and then there's this tidbit of their having a live Citizencon in October of next year. And since they didn't get too much flack for making 2022 a streaming-only event, then the only reason to spend the big resources to make 2023 a live event is that they want to show off something big and new to a cheering audience. They want that keynote kind of footage. So big cheering entrance in California in October, use that to power sales in the November ship sale, and then deliver in December. 1, 2, 3. Now, is that trying to put too much certainty on a process that we already know is fraught with uncertainty? Yes, but that must mean they have a plan B for what to make a centerpiece of all the money being spent on a live Citizencon. What could that be? My guess is a playable first mission of Squadron 42. The new master mode should be ready by then, have the players step through the first icebreaker mission, and then they get thousands of people gushing online about it. That should be worth the price of hosting a live Citizencon. Now, this paragraph introduced some information that was not in any of the patch notes, and that is that they already have a shard of record system that will remember your last shard and try to return you to it. This is the very simplest form of the matchmaking system, and the waiting queue is the first step beyond that. But I would suggest a few simple follow-on options. The first would be to join an Overflow shard. The Overflow shard would have limited persistence. Anything that I wanted persisted would have to be stowed into an inventory prior to logging out. Because sometimes you're just logging in to do a few housekeeping items. So, for example, filling up your inventory. So being limited to having to stow everything in inventory would let me do that without having to lose my connection to my primary gameplay space or having to wait a long line. And then the next follow-on feature would be a pursuit priority, because I can imagine criminals using shard hopping as a means of escaping bounty hunters. This paragraph gives a hint as to the inner workings of the replication layer, that there will be a replication layer worker services. The replication layer is unique in that it is communicating to both the simulation server and your client computer simultaneously. Having this sort of a middleman service is usually done to provide a common level of protection to the data layer irrespective of the system that was interfacing to it, client, game server, or global entity graph. That way, if any of these malperforms, they have to go through the worker process, which protects it from data corruption. This paragraph introduced a new term, the entity zone, and confirmed that something that was only a maybe or probably in prior communications and Q&A on server meshing was now a yes. And that was that the interior space of a large ship can be its own entity zone. This represents considerable technical challenge, which I will get into, but eliminates a worry that I was having about whether server meshing would be a stumbling block to one of the most long-standing immersion breakers in the persistent universe, and that is that planets and moons don't actually move in their orbits. But if the entity zone for a ship can move, then the entity zone for a planet can move too. In fact, to clarify these levels of technical challenge to this, I'm going to coin 3 terms. The first I will call fixed entity zones. These are entity zones whose physical relationship are unmoving to their parent. So, for example, there might be an entity zone for Lorville, but if Lorville is busy, it can be dynamically given its own game simulation server. But then in the case of the central business district becoming busy, it might get its own entity zone as a child of the Lorville entity zone. But the physical relationship between these two zones is not going to move, and the handoff zone, likely in the subway, isn't going to move either. Similarly, if they decide that the Lorville CBD might get too busy and they will define separate entity zones for the trading floor, the sales showroom, the lobby, and the train station, these two would be fixed entity zones, and the handoff zones for them would be the long hallways that we know are there. Now, most of the time, Lorville won't be that busy, so most of the time the simulation server will be hosting a particular entity zone and all the children, grandchildren, etc. underneath it. But with a fixed entity zone, it is relatively easy, and I am guessing that with the early server meshing phases, including both static server meshing and dynamic meshing version 1, will be using fixed entity zones. Kinetic energy zones move in relation to each other, but their parent-child relationship does not change. So, for example, the entity zone for Aberdeen will move when planetary motion is implemented, but the Aberdeen entity zone will always be a child of the greater Hurston entity zone. Similarly, entity zones for the various outposts on Aberdeen, such as Klesher Prison, will always be children of the Aberdeen entity zone. The fact that these kinetic entity zones move means that the handoff location from one to the level next, up or down, will be changing. But since the parent-child relationship is steady, that relationship is relatively easy to manage by the parent zone. But when you start to talk about an 890 jump having its own entity zone, that will no longer be the case. So I will use the term mobile entity zones for these. With the two prior types of entity zones, you are principally interested in handing off the player from one entity zone to another as they move about. But with a mobile entity zone of a large ship, the players are not handed off. They stay with the zone typically, and the entity zone is handed off from one parent to another parent, in addition to their motion within the parent zone. This will need a lot more coding to calculate and implement the handoff locations and processes. Can they actually get all of that operating by the end of next year? No, but that's not what they are promising. Their promise for 4.0 has been, and apparently remains, a static mesh of 4 servers per shard. This could be done with as little as 4 fixed entity zones. They will likely actually be a much larger list of entity zones with just a few root entity zones with each on a static server. But I think it is important to keep in mind that what Chris described in his letter is not everything that will be in 4.0 with Pyro, but just a subset of it, and with the rest of what he described coming along in further 4.x patches. Now for an update on our giveaways. First, we have the Waiting for 3.18 Piloting Skills Contest. For the most amazing landing of a ship, Hercules size or larger, for your choice of any of the Crusader Spirit series ships, see the link in the description for that. And then there is the Grow the Channel ship giveaway for the winner's choice of the Galaxy Complete, the Modular Mining Moving Medical Machine, and the Merchantman, the Banu Big Box Bargain Bazaar. 1 entry per video. Current members are entered automatically. And everybody else, just subscribe and comment with the secret word. And the secret word for this video is the first of the types of entity zones that I described. Fly safe, keep it real, and I'll see you in the verse. This is Danny Raymond for Ray's Guide.